Welcome to this episode of the Harpreet Singh Show. I'm your host Harpreet Singh from Surrey, British Columbia, Canada. In today's program, we're going to talk on a very important aspect, and that is importance of sex and gender in health research and sciences. And I'll be joined by Karen Davison, and we'll be talking on this important aspect because this is the paper that is being read at the CINI 2022 conference. So let's get Karen on the show and continue with the discussion. Karen, good evening. How are you?
I'm great. And how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much. Thank you. So
Great.
please tell our viewers a little bit about yourself. What is your background? And as a researcher, you have been with the KPU for how long? What all do you do?
Sure. So, as you've introduced, my name is Karen Davison, and I've worked at Kwantlen Polytech University since 2014. I started part-time and went up to full-time. And my work there is to do teaching as well as applied research. So my research is primarily in the area of nutrition. I'm a registered dietitian by background. However, I do like to look at nutrition in the context of many different factors, of which sex and gender is one factor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what will be myself and a colleague, Pulindu Ratnaskara, who is a statistician, will be presenting at the Canada-India Network Society.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So from the research that you're doing, and today what we are talking about, this aspect which you're going to highlight in the CINI 2022 conference, what is the role of gender or sex as far as health research is concerned?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So when we think about sex and gender, they're two separate concepts that we need to be aware of. So I don't know if everybody really understands that there are differences between sex and gender. So when we talk about sex, we're talking about this biological construct that defines male and female by their genetics, by their anatomy, and by their physiology. So if you've ever filled out a survey, for example, you'll often see that question, are you male or female? And you check off one of the boxes. So that's what we consider sex. Now, you may well imagine that that in itself is a limiting factor when we think about the diverse population. We all aren't really necessarily defined as being male and female. So what more and more we're seeing in the research, and there still needs to be a long way to go with this, is also considering gender.
Mm-hmm.
So gender is this multifaceted, fluid concept, and it changes over time based on a person's social environment and their cultural environment. And it leads to sort of defining gender norms, how we act and interact with one another, for example. So we may think of gender, and this is just a very simplistic way of thinking of it, is more about femininity and masculinity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So although they're two separate concepts, it's they interact, right? So the sex that you're born with will interact with your social environment, your cultural environment over time to define your gender identity, for example. So in research, why it is important is that you need to actually account for both of these factors when you're looking to conduct any kind of research in health, because these influence how people interpret the world, how
Mm-hmm.
they access health services, how they interact with practitioners and other health professionals. And so research needs to account for this to ensure that the science is rigorous and to ensure that it's more impactful, because we're using research as a decision tool for deciding what health services are we going to offer and in what way, or what
Mm-hmm.
health programs are we going to offer to, say, a certain group and in what way. And also, if we think more broadly, it influences health policy. So sort of the national level decision making around health and how, for example, we're going to allocate budget and that kind of thing.
Right. So in this conference, CINI conference, you're presenting two researches that you have done. and when it comes to mental health and immigration status, and how does this differ by gender? What points have come out in this particular research?
Right. So, as you mentioned at the Canada Indian Network Society conference, we're going to highlight two research projects that considered sex as a variable. It didn't measure gender per se, and I can talk a little bit later about how you might measure gender, but it did account for gender-related variables in the analysis. So, the analysis itself involved looking at the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging. So that is a research initiative that began back in 2012, and it's a cohort study. So it's being done over time and longitudinally, where they're following adults between the ages of 45 to 85 across Canada. So Surrey is actually one of the sites for data collection. And they look at many different factors. So sex, other and social factors, economic factors, biological measures, such as physiological tests that have been done, genetic factors, and blood work that people get done. It looks at different health outcomes, so different physical and mental health outcomes. So our national team, that's led by Esme Folson at the University of Toronto, focuses on differences by immigrant status when it comes to health outcomes in this age group. And in the analysis that I'm going to just describe now is when we first looked at it, we wanted to see if there was an interaction between immigrant status and sex. So we did that analysis and we found that there was an interaction. And so what that tells us is that we needed to separate the analysis for women and separate the analysis for men. So the analysis being regression modeling, so looking at different variables to predict depression in these groups. So what we did find is when we did the separate analysis, so if you were an immigrant, there was a higher and significantly higher likelihood that you would be experiencing depression. And then if you look at when compared to people who were Canadian born, then when you look at the immigrants specifically, women who are immigrants were much more likely to experience depression. And again, that was significant when compared to male immigrants. And this is immigrants that have been in Canada anywhere from like in the past year to like 20 years. So this was very important findings in that it tells us that when we think about programming, not only do we need to think about immigrant status and how we might deliver programs differently in order to foster their health, we also need to consider differences between immigrants who are men and women. So, for example, women who are immigrants, the reason why they may be experiencing depression could be based on gender roles. So, for example, when a couple moves to Canada, what has been found, it's generally the man in the house who has the job or that works outside the house, whereas it's women who tend to stay at home, do the housework and look after children, for example. And so this was thought to be an underlying factor contributing to depression because they may not just be out amongst other people and getting a lot of sort of social interaction and that kind of thing. And so when we think about programming for this group, you would want to focus on, well, maybe they could do programming for immigrant women that helps them to find a job role outside the house, or helps with childcare so that they can work outside the house, or to try and foster more social interaction amongst their peers by joining in on program activities and that kind of thing. So, yeah, we found that this was very interesting, and there's many other reasons that could be contributing, but that was one that we thought was a key one. So.
That's interesting. So basically, when you do this research, of course, it is widespread. It is you collect data and then you analyze that and then you come to conclusions. And as you said, that this also helps in policy framing at the higher level. Like for example, this particular thing about depression, what you have pointed out, and especially in women who are immigrants, they are more prone to depression and they face more kind of challenges. Now, when you do the research, Karen, just for the common persons who are watching this program today, because they would like to know that once you analyze all these things and you come out with the reasons and then you provide it further, what kind of action is taken on these reports? Are these just researches done for research purposes only, or also they have an influence later on in policy decision making?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because sometimes people may not necessarily understand the role of research and its purpose. So basically, any research that we do, the plan is that we want to disseminate, get that information out there so that health service providers, health policymakers look at the research and integrate it into their everyday practice.
Right.
So one part of our research is really like, let's look at the national data. Let's see what the important trends are, the important significant findings. Then we develop different knowledge dissemination tools, or different tools to try and get that message across. So things like infographics that are meant for the general population that really just pull out those key findings. We go and meet with health providers and practitioners and health policymakers to tell them about our findings and encourage them to take it up. And then in some instances, we actually have the opportunity then to engage with those people that are working on the front lines with immigrants, for example, to help them with developing programming and actually evaluating that programming. So so it can seem sometimes research sort of happens in this independent sort of ivory tower and it doesn't get out there. But that's really our intent, is that we really want to make Canadians' lives better by really looking at what factors contribute to quality of life, and then how can we better foster, say, the person's experience when they immigrate to Canada and transition to Canadian society. So that's really, and it's been an under-researched area, and it's very critical. So, I mean, we've done different things by working with, say, groups like Diversity and other immigrant societies locally, again, to do things that are at the front line in terms of changing programs and seeing how, people respond to that.
Excellent. Another study that you're presenting is about the blood chromium levels in relation to type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. What are the researchers saying as far as this issue is concerned?
Right. So I'll just start by explaining a little bit why we selected this, because maybe a lot of people might not know the importance of of chromium. So as I mentioned earlier in the interview, I'm a dietitian by background, and chromium is a trace mineral, which is considered essential. So when we say in nutrition language that if a nutrient is essential, it means that your body needs it in a certain amount in order to function properly and to prevent chronic disease development. So there's been a lot of controversy or debate about chromium as being an essential nutrient, largely because there hasn't been a whole lot of research in that area, because it's really a difficult mineral to assess in the diet. So it's really hard to quantify it in foods because it's in such small amounts, and up to about a few years ago, it really wasn't possible to measure levels in the blood, which is really the nice objective measure of a person's chromium status. So why is chromium considered essential? Well, it has many different roles, but the key one is that it's involved in carbohydrate and fat metabolism because it influences the hormone insulin. So insulin is involved in fat and carbohydrate metabolism. So the reason why we wanted to look at blood chromium levels, and the the survey at which we looked at was it was a U.S. Database that's called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. So it was the first national survey to actually measure blood chromium levels and have it as a variable. So we were really excited about that because everything up to that date, there hasn't been on blood chromium, and any research that has been done, it's been in very small samples. So we had a very nice sample size in this, and we wanted to examine, okay, what is the relationship between blood chromium levels and cardiovascular disease? So that was one analysis.
Right.
And then the other analysis was looking at blood chromium levels in relation to diabetes. And so again, we accounted for men and women, and this was in the age group of 40 years and older. And the reason for that is that was the group in which they did blood chromium levels, because that group is, if they're going to have low blood chromium levels, it's probably going to occur in like mid to older age. So what we did is we looked at these two health outcomes, diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and we found interesting differences. So when we think about cardiovascular disease, what we found is that males or men who had low blood chromium levels, they were more likely to have cardiovascular disease. There was no association that was found for women.
Right.
And so again, what this tells us is that chromium status differs between men and women. And so then, it helps to determine, okay, well, how are we going to target messages around getting more chromium in the diet amongst these different groups? So we can, educate about foods that are good sources of chromium, for example, that kind of thing. So, so that was found in the cardiovascular research. And I should also just mention, we did look at other factors too, and there was differences by men and women. So what we found, what was similar between the two groups, is that the outcome of cardiovascular disease was pretty much the same if they had high body weight status, so a high BMI. But we found differences in terms of education, in that we found that women who were more educated, more likely to have cardiovascular disease compared to men. So there was some really interesting differences across those other variables in the relationship to cardiovascular disease. Okay, so that was the one analysis. The other was on diabetes. And what we found was that in both men and women, there was a higher likelihood of diabetes if they had low blood chromium levels. And so again, there was differences across other variables as well. So in that group, again, if they tended to be overweight in both men and women, that was associated with diabetes. Whereas there was differences if a woman was experiencing depression, there was a higher likelihood that they had diabetes, but we didn't see that for men. So there was some really, again, interesting findings that inform, okay, how are we going to educate people about diabetes prevention and cardiovascular disease prevention, and how are we going to target the different messages for men and for women so that so it's going to be meaningful to them and really help in reducing their risk of cardiovascular disease or diabetes.
Okay. That's really very commendable and interesting. It's new to us. And so, Kiran, is it always that health researchers or programs which are being made, they look into this sex and gender considerations, or is it sometimes?
And just to clarify, you're asking about health services?
Yes, your researchers and health programs which are done. So in that, is it that always sex and gender consideration is included, or is it according to the research that you are doing, then you bring in this aspect?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So for most, and I would say, if not all, research that's done, it's very much ingrained that you look at sex, the male-female differences. So that has been, been around for a number of years, and any kind of research that doesn't account for that, it would be really hard to get it, accepted for publication, or to have stakeholders like health providers really consider it.
Mm-hmm.
So now, when we think about gender, um, it's much harder to include as a variable because, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very fluid construct. It's impacted by many different factors such as race, ethnicity, by place of residence, right? It's shaped by a person's social and cultural surroundings. So it is not generally considered in health research. And I think that that's, the message we want to drive home
Right.
at the Canada Indian Network Societies. We need to start looking at this more. So
Mm-hmm.
there are now measures that researchers can develop based on other variables in their database. So, such as looking at a person's occupation,
Mm-hmm.
the number of hours they spend at housework, and the type of housework that they do. Um, and so these variables can be put together as sort of this composite one measure of gender. So, for example, there's a gender index. The labor force uh, of government in Canada, the labor force surveys also now have a labor force gender
Mm-hmm.
index. So those are being used more, but there's a long way still to go. And you think about, okay, all of our research historically has been based on male female dichotomy, but from this point forward, we really want to be including gender in all of that analysis. And our agencies, such as the Canadian Institute of Health Research, which is one of the tri-councils,
Mm-hmm.
you have to upfront explain in your application how you're going to account for both sex and
Okay.
gender. And
Mm-hmm.
that's been since about 2010.
Right.
So it is more and more. And I should also just add that any research that has been done looking at where they consider sex and gender in the same study and its relationship to a given disease, it's been shown that gender, that variable, tends to present higher risk to a disease outcome, such as cardiovascular disease. So it's really between the two variables. Gender
Right.
is tends to be the one to really focus on, which we haven't been doing, unfortunately. So
Okay. Right. As far as this conference is concerned, the focus is on integrative health and women's health. And as a nutritionist, Karen, what do you feel? How do conferences of these kind further impact towards integrative thinking, and why is it necessary now? It's becoming more and more open now that medicine is coming forward in the form of integrative approach to health. So, how is that important?
yeah, integrative health is critically important, right? When you think about, if you want to really think about the whole person and how to prevent diseases for people as well as manage diseases and think about the whole person, integrative health is really the approach to use, right? Biomedicine is good and is really good when we think about treating disease, but if we think of other approaches to integrate and complement that, it really can make a difference in terms of people's quality of life and managing their diseases. So when we think about sex and gender in that context, the first thing that comes to mind when we think about other health approaches that are outside of biomedicine that people might use, like chiropractic services or like nutritional supplement use or that kind of thing. Traditionally, when you look at the research, it's always seems to show that women tend to use those services more, or to use, alternative practices. So you have to kind of think, well, why is that? Is it something that is just more accepted by women, or is it something that that they, maybe it has to do with their relationship with the biomedical system, right? Maybe they have different opinions about biomedicine, and that's why they look at alternative practices. So that's a whole field in itself that researchers could explore to, like, why is there these differences, and why how can you engage men more into integrative health and to exploring different services. So yeah, that's a very interesting question, and one that I don't think has really been explored that much, besides sort of describing services that are used by men and women, and that's it. But they don't necessarily explore the why. And that's really where you need to think about, well, maybe it's their role in the house or their occupations that contribute to that.
Okay. And Karen, anything in conclusion you would like to add about this topic, what we have touched today?
Yeah, I again can't stress enough, when we think about research and when we think about health services delivery, that sex and gender is very important. But I don't want everyone to think that that's the only thing that's important. So sex and gender does interact with other factors, such as a person's occupation, their upbringing, their social environment, their social supports. So although I've really emphasized particularly gender needs to be considered more, we need to think about how that intersects with other factors as well. So it's exciting times because we have better tools and research to measure these and to analyze these. And it'll be interesting to see, how health services and research evolves over the next 5 to 10 years, now that we have these different resources at our fingertips.
Right. Wonderful. It was a pleasure talking to you, Karen. Thank you very much for shedding light on this important issue. Thanks for your time.
Great. And thank you.
Welcome. Have a good evening. ਸੋ ਇਹ ਸਨ ਸਾਡੇ ਅੱਜ ਦੇ ਮਹਿਮਾਨ ਕੈਰਨ ਡੈਵਿਸਨ ਕੁਆਂਟਲਨ ਪੋਲੀਟੈਕ ਯੂਨੀਵਰਸਿਟੀ ਤੋਂ, ਤੇ ਅੱਜ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕੀਤੀ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਤੇ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਕਿ ਜੋ ਸਿਨੀ ਕਾਨਫਰੰਸ 18th ਅਤੇ 19th ਜੂਨ ਨੂੰ ਹੋਣ ਜਾ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ, ਉਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਇਹ ਪ੍ਰੈਜ਼ੈਂਟ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ ਇੰਪੋਰਟੈਂਸ ਆਫ ਸੈਕਸ ਐਂਡ ਜੈਂਡਰ ਇਨ ਹੈਲਥ ਰਿਸਰਚ ਐਂਡ ਸਾਇੰਸਿਸ, ਤੇ ਇਸ ਦੀ ਕੀ ਮਹੱਤਤਾ ਹੈ ਤੇ ਕੀ ਕੁਝ ਇਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾਂਦਾ ਹੈ, ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਜਾਣੂ ਕਰਵਾਇਆ. ਐਂਡ ਦ ਪਰਪਸ ਇਜ਼ ਟੂ ਇੰਪਰੂਵ ਦ ਕੁਆਲਿਟੀ ਆਫ ਲਾਈਫ, and that is what they are working on, and this research leads further on to better policy framing by the governments. Every evening, Monday to Friday, 6 to 7 p.m. onwards, we share with you different topics, and I have different guests. If you also want to be a part of this program, you can contact me anywhere in the world through WhatsApp at 604-603-7555, because the purpose of this program is to inspire you, educate you, and to empower you. So you can also email me at harpreetsingshow@gmail.com. ਇੱਥੇ ਹੀ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਦੀ ਸਮਾਪਤੀ, ਫਿਰ ਮੁਲਾਕਾਤ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ. Have a safe evening, stay healthy and enjoy yourself.